Now that you've seen an example of a metabolic conditioning session in action, let's break it down so we can analyse it. As you will see, Ian's goals were to improve his anaerobic capacity, his aerobic capacity, and reduce his body fat. So from the personal profile form, we established that he wanted to get ripped up and be really, really fit. So let's look at how I put the session together in order to achieve that goal. The first warm-up that I conducted was called a functional warm-up pattern. And it was about 10 to 15 reps of functional movement patterns. And the intent here was to prepare the muscle, the fascia, the nervous system, and to help increase his range of motion so that he was ready to go and he was ready for the intensity in which I was going to put him under for the actual session. The movements themselves consisted of basic compound exercises, such as the bodyweight squat with a rotation. Then I moved him to the alternating backwards lunge with overhead lifts, a side lunge with a forward swing, and then I got him into a prone position on a plank with alternating row and rotation. Whilst he was warming up, I was also using this as an opportunity to assess him, and I was using these exercises as a dynamic postural evaluation. So from these actual dynamic movements, I could see and assess how well he was going to move. And this again enabled me to move forward with the session. You will notice that after doing the functional warm-ups, I then got him to perform about 5 repetitions of the different exercises that I was going to use in the session. The reason behind this was so that I could set the resistance, work out the correct weight that's going to be necessary for him, and to also check his technique and check his form on each of those exercises. Another reason for me doing this is so that I could teach him the flow, so he knew what exercise he was going to go to next, and this in itself will help to increase or contribute to the overall intensity of the session. The workout. So the workout itself is pretty simple in that there were only 5 exercises, but it was the way in which they were put together that contributed to the overall intensity of the session. So A1 was the medicine ball throwdowns, A2 was the dumbbell squat press, A3 the cable lunge row, A4 the push-up with alternating dumbbell row, and A5 was the boso leaps. So these are all good examples of big compound exercises which, from a metabolic perspective, when done at intensity, are going to increase the intensity and create a metabolic burn, which is necessary for his goal of achieving anaerobic fitness and dropping that body fat. You could choose to use time as the variable here, or you could choose to use repetitions. Now, as you will see, in round 1, I let him go through each of those exercises, but it was obvious that he was starting to struggle on the dumbbell squat press. So you would have noticed that as I came into round 2, I decreased the weight, and this was because his technique was being compromised. Throughout the entire session, I was constantly performing 3D PT. In other words, I was walking around him so I could ascertain and assess his quality of movement. Now, ordinarily, I would actually come to the front of Ian on most of those exercises, but due to the filming, I couldn't stand in front of the camera. So you'll often see that I was making reference to the mirror and using the mirror as a way of assessing him from the front. Because the intensity of the session was so high and those exercises were quite complex, it also required that I constantly cued him in regards to his form. And this is very important. As the intensity of a session goes up, it is important that the technique stays really, really good. The higher intensity, the more likely there is of somebody getting injured, and this is something we want to avoid. In order for me to help understand or help get him to the required intensity in order for him to achieve those goals, I was constantly asking where he was at on his PRE scale. And you'll hear me saying this time and time again. Again, this is a great way of assessing somebody and assessing where the client is at in order to take them to the required level. The rest between each exercise wasn't really a rest as such, but more of a transition phase. And that was about 10 to 15 seconds, so I wouldn't really count that as a rest. However, between each round, I gave him roughly a 60 to 90 second rest between sets. In order to get the intensity that you require, please make sure that you're very diligent with your clients and make sure that you really set these rest periods. Because otherwise, if they start chatting to you, those rest periods can go on, and before you know it, you're not getting the work done. Once he completed those 5 rounds, it was time for him to come down to a cool down and to a stretch. So all I did here was let him walk. He performed an active recovery and he just basically walked until his heart rate came down. And then from there, I moved into some hands-on stretches, particularly for his lower back, his hamstrings, and his glutes. My advice to Ian, post-workout, was to go and consume a meal that was high in protein and high in low GI carbohydrates, especially within that first 30 minutes post-workout, in order to help his body repair and recover. The other advice I had for Ian was to perform another 1 to 2 sessions per week in conjunction with his strength training program. So hopefully that has given you some insight as to why I did what I did for Ian in order for him to achieve his goals of increasing his anaerobic fitness and for losing body fat, or in his words, for getting shredded and ripped up.